Hello, thank you for clicking on this Pete and Sherry video. I am your host Julian, and boy, this is depressing. There's nothing on the table in front of me. Why is that? Why no Scotch? Because I'm practicing what I preach. This video is on Scotch terms, terms which you should know. Why is it important to know them? Because once you know them, you can forget all about them and just enjoy Scotch. That's what I'm going to do. Moonshine. Whiskey is a distilled spirit derived from grain, specifically from a fermented mash of grain and water. It's a very broad category, but that does differentiate it from spirits that are derived from other things, such as cognac is derived from wine, vodka from the potato, and rum from sugarcane. Scotch whiskey, or just Scotch, is a subset of whiskey. It is spelled without an E. Every other kind of whiskey is spelled with an E except for Canadian whiskey. I'm telling you this because if you spell Scotch whiskey with an E, people will think you're a noob. They won't say it, but they will think it. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with being a noob. I'm kind of a noob myself, but I don't like to look like one unintentionally, and I assume you don't either. Scotch is unique among the terms that I'll be defining in that it is not defined by tradition. It is defined very specifically by international agreement. In order to be called Scotch, a whiskey must be made in Scotland. It must be made from malted barley or grain. It must be matured in oak barrels for at least 3 years. It must be at least 40% alcohol, and it may contain no additives except water and E150A caramel coloring. Not surprisingly, that last one, caramel coloring, is a little controversial, but it's also very much part of the landscape, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. There are a lot of other subsets of whiskey: bourbon whiskey, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, Japanese whiskey, and I'm leaving out a bunch. Essentially, any country that can produce grain probably has whiskey in it somewhere. Malt whiskey, which is my favorite subset of whiskey, is whiskey made entirely from malted barley. Malted barley is barley that has been allowed to germinate. That's a very time and resource intensive process, but it increases the chemical complexity. It causes the sucrose to turn in large part to maltose, which is a much softer taste, and it also has the effect of sort of softening the mouth feel of the whiskey a bit. A malt whiskey shouldn't bite into your mucous membranes. It should slide down your throat. Malt whiskey and Scotch whiskey are overlapping spheres. There is a lot of Scotch malt whiskey. There is a lot of Scotch that isn't malt whiskey. And there is a lot of malt whiskey that isn't Scotch. Now, malt whiskey is produced all over the world, just as whiskey is. But there are a couple of countries that I want to single out because I think they're doing a particularly interesting job with it right now. The Japanese make malt whiskey that is so close to the Scottish style that it's often sold in the Scotch sections, and they cannot call it Scotch. That's the only thing. The word Scotch can't appear anywhere on the bottle. It can say that it's made in the Scottish style, but that's as close as they can come. Also, in America right now, there is something coming into existence, American malt whiskey, that traditionally hasn't really existed at all. And my own little quarter of the world here, Central Virginia, is becoming a malt whiskey producing region. Up the road from here, there's Copper Fox Distillery that makes Wassmans, and down the road from here, Eads is coming online in Nelson County. Okay, what I'm going to talk about now is the different varieties of Scotch that you can find. All Scotch falls into one of 5 categories. Here they are. Here are the 5 kinds of Scotch. There's single grain Scotch, blended grain Scotch, single malt Scotch, blended malt Scotch, and blended Scotch. A malt Scotch is a Scotch made from only malted barley. A grain Scotch is a Scotch made from both malted barley and whole grains. There is no such thing as a Scotch that is made with absolutely no malted barley. If a grain Scotch is made entirely at a single distillery, it is a single grain Scotch. If a Scotch is made by blending grain Scotches from different distilleries, it's a blended grain Scotch. If a malt Scotch is made entirely by a single distillery, it is a single malt Scotch. If malt scotches from different distilleries are blended together, it becomes a blended malt scotch. And if a grain scotch is blended with a malt scotch, it becomes a blended scotch. You will note the heavy use of the word blended to mean both multiple distilleries and multiple kinds of scotch is the thing that makes this a little confusing. Also, the word single, when used before malt or grain, never refers to there being only one grain used in the scotch or there having been only one malting. It always refers to the distillery, that there was a single distillery involved in the producing of that grain whiskey or that malt whiskey. Unless, of course, the word single comes before the word cask, in which case it refers to an actual single cask. There. Clear as the summer sun.